Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me. We'll just wait a minute or two to let the other people join, and then we'll start. One more minute, and then we'll kick it off. Great. I think we'll start now. Hopefully everyone can hear me. Welcome. My name is Christopher Furlan. I'm the head of training quality assurance here at GWO. And today we're going to do this webinar for the next hour, looking at the GWO requirements that were just released and the main updates that are coming through with these two new releases. We are recording this, so you will be able to see it later on. And at the end as well, we'll show you how to get in contact with us if you do have any additional questions. So hopefully everyone can see the presentation. I'll now start now. So in this webinar, we'll go through a brief introduction of the key changes, so the most significant changes for the requirements for certification and the requirements for training. Then I'll provide an overview of where you can find some supporting documents and additional information that may help. And then finally, I'll answer some of the questions that were submitted prior to this webinar. We only have an hour, so I'm not going to be able to go through all of the changes, but I'll do my best to cover most of the most significant ones. Good. So just a bit of a background for where this update came from, or where these updates came from. Over the past year, the GWO team has been working, looking at how can we improve the GWO governance and how can we improve the system. And throughout the entire year, I've been collecting feedback from certification bodies, from training providers and auditors pertaining to both the requirements of certification and the requirements for training. We also had a project running last year. You may have seen it on the website, looking into digitalization and training and how digital technologies can work within the GWO training sphere. We also reviewed the instructor qualification process, and we've also developed the recognition scheme, which is a new addition to the requirements, which weren't in there before. So it's a completely new section. I will say that these updates in both of these documents really focus on trying to clarify some of the inconsistencies that were there before. So you will notice in the start of both the requirements for training and the requirements for certification, there is a fairly substantial definition section put in. So now the words that are being used can be looked up and the meanings behind those words are quite clear now. We also looked at how can we simplify the scheme in places where maybe it was a little bit complex before, and also how we can standardize any of the existing requirements that we've had. And of course, where possible, we're trying to reduce the amount of requirements and make the governance more flexible compared to what it has been. I'll also let everyone know that there's a 6-month grace period. This applies to both the requirements for certification and the requirements for training. This is something that we also have for all of our training standards. What it means essentially is that from the 1st of October 2025, you can no longer use version 13 of the requirements for certification or version 14 of the requirements for training. So you have until then to implement the changes. With regards to the grace period, it's one or the other, meaning that you can't take half of the requirements from version 14 of the requirements of certification and half of them from version 13 of the requirements of certification and mix and match. It's one or the other. What I'll do now, I'm going to go through the requirements of certification first and focus on the main and most significant changes and the updates and what they mean. Please note that there are additional changes in there that will not be covered in this webinar. You can go into the start of the requirements and there's a change log, and this will guide you through where those additional changes are. But due to the time constraints, I'm not going to cover them all here. So the first change is in clause that I'm going to cover today is in clause 5.2.2. So the prerequisite auditor qualification has been updated. So now both a 9001 and 45001 lead auditor can conduct audits. Previously, it was only a ISO 45001 lead auditor that could conduct the entire audit, whilst the 9001 lead auditor was limited to the management system portion of the audit. Please note that this is a prerequisite qualification. The auditors still need to, of course, do the AQT and ADT and make sure that they are remaining within the qualification requirements to audit GWO training. The next section here, which we've done an update on, is to actually allow for the supervision of the auditor under training during the stage 2 audit to be done remotely. So the supervising auditor doesn't have to be present during the physical audit. The auditor under training still does, of course, so the audit still needs to be a physical audit. But this should create less of a burden on qualifying auditors going forward. The next update is to do with the conducting of audits. So clause 6.1.3, certification audits must be conducted using the latest version of the requirements and training standards. In the previous version, the clause actually allowed the certification body and training provider to decide which version could be used to actually conduct the certification audit. Now it needs to be the latest, and this of course also applies to grace periods. Clause 6.3.13, the witnessing training, when witnessing training part of the audit, the instructor being witnessed must be a GWO qualified instructor who is subject to the annual instructor assessment part of the ongoing competency program run by the training provider being audited. This means that when an auditor is out there witnessing training, that the person or persons delivering the training are actually the training providers who, are the instructors who are subject to that training provider's ongoing competency assessment, meaning that they're part of that instructor core for that training provider. You can no longer use external instructors to come in and conduct training as part of the audit. Has to be a training provider that's part of that training organization. Clause 6.4.1, surveillance audits must be conducted at earliest 10 months after the valid from date on the certificate and no later than 14 months after the valid date on the certificate. This isn't actually a change, it's only a change in the wording. This was previously described in the same way. However, it was unclear, so we've made it clearer. So essentially, you cannot go out and do your surveillance audit until at least 10 months after the previous audit, but no later than 14 months. So previously it used to say in the earlier version, plus minus 2 months within the 12 months period. This is just clarifying exactly what that means. Clause 6.4.3, if a training provider is already certified to deliver a specific GWO module and wishes to deliver learning objectives pertaining to the knowledge digitally, a separate audit or digital certification is not required. This is quite a significant change. In addition, we have this one. If a training provider is already certified to deliver a specific GWO module and wishes to deliver learning objectives pertaining to skills and abilities digitally, then a full audit, including witnessing of training and a separate digital learning certification is required. This audit could be remote. This is quite a significant change. We will go through it in more detail later when we visit the requirements for training. What I will highlight here, however, which is quite important, it's not possible to have a digital-only GWO training. A training provider must first be delivering that training in a fixed or mobile setting, and then, as an extension of scope, put it over to the digital certificate. Now, that only applies for skills and abilities. If you look at clause 6.4.3 there, what it's saying is if you're delivering using digital technologies to deliver within the knowledge domain, you do not require a separate certification of that technology, which is the case for the previous version of the requirements of certification. Clause 6.8.6, if a training provider intends to transfer into the multi-site scheme, the certification body must inform GWO of the transition prior to the audit report being submitted. In the earlier version, the BSTRP existed. This has now been removed. The BSTRP, for those who don't know, was a basic safety training refresher partial. It was implemented during the COVID-19 pandemic as a mitigation to all of the lockdowns. The standard itself is no longer valid, and the training standard doesn't exist anymore, and therefore we're also removing it from the requirements of certification. Clause 7.1.10. Training providers transferring into the multi-site scheme are no longer required to align all settings and modules into the same certification cycle. There are now two options they can take. The old option, which is all training sites, training settings, and GWO modules are in the same certification cycle. All sites will be included on a single certificate. We got feedback saying that training providers and certification bodies would like more flexibility within the multi-site scheme. Therefore, we've added Part B here, where each individual site may have a different certification cycle. The annual sampling plan for each of the individual sites must follow the central function audit, and each site may have a separate certificate. So hopefully this will improve the flexibility around the multi-site scheme. The new section with recognition that's coming into requirements for training also has some additional clauses within the requirements of certification. So for the recognition audit, the audit itself must verify compliance with the requirements for the recognition scheme. The guidance for the duration is 3 hours. And for following a successful audit, the training provider will be certified as a recognition provider. What that means, we'll go into later. Recognition is also available for multi-site training providers. In this case, they can have an extension of scope audit, and the audit will be conducted from the central site, and if successful, the central site will be recognized as a recognition provider for all sites within the certificate. Now going to jump into one that I'm going to use a fairly significant amount of time on because most of the big changes live here. One of the key things that we'll start with is instructors. So instructors are covered in two sections of the requirements for training, in section 6 and then again in the actual instructor qualification section. In section 6, this is the general requirements for a training provider. Here now it says that all training providers must register their affiliated instructors and the modules they're qualified to deliver in WINDA. This includes All instructors subject to annual instructor assessment and part of the training provider's ongoing competency plan. All new instructors qualified through the instructor qualification process, and any instructors who deliver GWO training operated by the training provider. This means that all instructors now need to be registered in instructor affiliations in WINDA. If you haven't been in there yet, you'll find in your WINDA profile as a training provider, there will be an instructor affiliation section that you can go into to do this. Some people may be thinking, well, what happens if one instructor is working for multiple training providers? In this case, each training provider will need to register their instructor. And that's why it's called instructor affiliation. So we're looking at essentially those instructors that are affiliated with a training provider, not only those ones who are employed. For multi-site training providers, instructor affiliations can be registered to a training provider group in WINDA, meaning that the training provider will not be required to create individual instructor affiliations for each site. And we'll get to the instructor qualification assessment form later on, but you also need to upload the instructor qualification assessment forms into WINDA for each instructor. A new form will need to be re-uploaded each year following the annual competency assessment of the instructor. Some of you may have noticed the INST WINDA training record has disappeared. It's being phased out, being replaced by the new instructor affiliation in WINDA. So it will no longer be available. Another quite significant change is clause 6.2.1. This is to do with documentation and training records. The time to upload WINDA training records has changed from 10 working days to 7 calendar days. There's a couple of reasons for this. The main one being that the definition of working day actually is different in different countries. Therefore, it was very difficult to understand actually what that meant. So we've changed it to calendar days. When the 7 days actually starts is from the day following the training. So if you have a training that's completed on a Monday, day 1 of the 7 calendar days starts on the Tuesday. So if you're delivering the entire BST throughout a week using the 5 days, and you want to upload all of the WINDA training records for that cohort of people going through all 5 days, you can do it on the Monday afterwards. Participants feedback survey. So previously in clause 6.2.11, we required training providers to create their own participant satisfaction survey and publish it on the website. We're no longer requiring you guys to do this. Instead, we're shifting away from a participant satisfaction survey to participant feedback, focusing on the training itself. The training provider will be required to inform participants of the purpose of the feedback survey prior to the training using the purpose statement available on the GWO website. And again, this is to highlight over for the participants the importance that their feedback has on helping us develop and improve the training and the training standards going forward. The participant feedback forms will be distributed by GWO via WINDA. If a training provider still wishes to conduct their own participant satisfaction survey for the delivery of GWO training, you're welcome to do this. However, there are requirements for what it needs to include, and these are again outlined in 6.2.11. Clause 7.1, we're getting into training settings. So 7.11 is, or 7.1, sorry, is the general requirements of training and resources. There's quite a lot within that clause, talking about equipment, talking about training center setups, etc. I'm not going to go through all of the clauses within that. Just note that we have added digital resources throughout that section to highlight what they need to be able to do. We've also removed clause 7.2.9. This clause used to state on-site training also includes when taking when training takes place during a maximum of 12-month period at a fixed training facility that is not a training provider's own GWO fixed training facility. This has been removed, and the other clauses that exist for fixed facilities now apply. The section on digital learning has been updated significantly. I just described this a little bit in the requirements of certification, but it's again here described in more detail for the requirements of training. So in clause 7.2.12, a GWO training providers certified to deliver fixed and mobile facilities may use digital learning technologies to deliver training elements within the knowledge domain. This does not require a separate audit or separate digital certification. So for example, if we have a training center here, which has decided to shift from the classroom-based training and make an e-learning, but then delivers the practical elements of the training in the fixed training facility, this would be the same as having a fixed training center which delivers the theoretical part by a PowerPoint, for example. What it means is you only need one certificate, and that's for the fixed training facility. Previously, you would have needed two separate certificates, one for the e-learning and one for the training facility. So this is quite a big change. What we're doing here is we're shifting away from a focus on types of technology to what the technology needs to be able to do. So it's all linked now to the GWO taxonomy. In this case, we're linking to the knowledge domain, i.e. theoretical training. So making sure that there is something to measure it against. What it also means is that if you're going to be using digital technologies to deliver training within the skills or abilities domain, you do need to have a separate certification and audit. So for example, if we take the same training center as we just had in the previous example, and instead of doing an e-learning, they've decided to do virtual reality plus some practical training in the fixed training center. This would require two separate audits and two separate certificates, one for the virtual reality stuff and one for the digital setting. Another thing to be very aware of, and I've put it in here to bring it to everyone's attention, is that clause 7.2.14 has been clarified and updated. This clause covers what the training provider essentially needs to do when using digital learning technologies to ensure that the technology is actually suitable for the training. Here it states a training provider who employs digital learning technologies during delivery of GWO modules must have specific procedures in place for the use of these technologies and shall include descriptions of how the applied technology changes the affordance of interaction between the participants, the instructor, and the learning materials. Please note as well that definitions of words like affordances is in the start of the requirements. The procedure and descriptions must detail how any limitations are mitigated to achieve the instruction and assessment of all learning objectives for which technology is used. That bit's quite important here. The training provider needs to demonstrate how the digital learning technology is being used, both in relation to instruction and assessment of those learning objectives as described in the different standards. And this is what they need to be able to put in those procedures and descriptions, and how those mitigations are being put into place to ensure that the same level of learning is being achieved via the digital setting as would be in a fixed instructor in-person setting. The next bit I'm going to go over, which is also quite a significant change, is the instructor qualification process. So this again links into the affiliations in WINDA, but we'll get back to that in a second. if you've read the old version of the requirements of training, you would have noticed there were two separate processes. This has now been merged into one single process. The process now consists of 3 different steps. We have an instructional background, i.e. what you need to do. So again, this is only pertaining to initial instructor qualifications. So you have an instructional background, a module-specific qualification, and then an assessment portion. We can go through each one individually now. So instructional background, this is the prerequisite instructional background that anyone wanting to become a GWO training provider must have. There are 3 sort of options here. One is to complete the IQTX training. Alternatively, the completion of the GWO IQT. So this essentially replaces the 100 hours with a 72-hour course, time reduction. But it also ensures that we have a standardized minimum level to measure all our instructors against. And the third option is a successful completion of a formal instructor qualification program that meets or exceeds the IQT. Again, the IQT is the measure here. When doing this, you need to document it using a gap analysis template. The gap analysis template is produced by GWO and is downloaded via the website. And I'll go into that later on in this webinar to describe where exactly you can find that. The other thing about the instructional background is this is for new instructors only. We'll get to existing instructors in a second. The second part of the initial instructor qualification is the module-specific qualification. The module-specific qualification requires the training provider to create a module-specific qualification plan. The plan must address individual instructor needs, experience, competencies, and the risks specific to the module. We know, for example, working at heights is a much riskier module than first aid, for example. It also must look at the training provider's equipment and settings. Is this a mobile setting? Is it a fixed setting? All of these different considerations that need to be taken into account when qualifying an instructor to deliver. The plan should prepare the instructor candidate to independently deliver the specific module in accordance to the criteria listed in 8.1.3. We'll get to that in a bit. One of the things here that you'll notice in the note at the bottom, it does state that the POCD, which is participate, observe, co-deliver, deliver, can still be utilized. So for each module, you can use the POCD process to achieve module-specific qualification. The assessment criteria. This again was also part of the previous instructor qualification and remained the same for both the POCD and the alternative process, as it was called. The instructor qualification process must achieve confirmation that all instructors are able to independently deliver the full training module. This must be documented using the instructor qualification assessment form found in Annex 5 of the GWO Requirements for Training. The form needs to be used for each module, and we'll go over what the form actually entails later on. You'll also notice that at the bottom there, not under an orange banner, but under a grey banner, it does state that you also need to register the instructor inside WINDA in the instructor affiliations. And of course, that is something that will now apply for all modules going forward. Clause 8.2.3. This has been clarified. The wording before was a little bit vague, but to maintain a WINDA training record in a specific module, the instructor must deliver the full module or participate in the qualification of other instructors in the module within a 12-month period. If more than 12 months, the instructor must retake the GWO training within that module, either as a refresher or, where applicable, as a full training. So this will only apply to trainings where a refresher is part of that. So for example, the BST. And what we're referring to here now is an instructor's WINDA training record. So if an instructor has a WINDA training record for, let's say for first aid, that instructor wants to teach first aid or is qualified to teach first aid, sorry, and they do that within a year, then they will achieve the refresher training for that first aid and maintain that. Another instructor, let's say for example, that delivers the BST, but only delivers sea survival, will not be able to have their first aid refreshed via delivering sea survival because that's a different module to their to the WINDA training record for first aid. They will need to go and take the first aid refresher course, just like everyone else. So it only applies to those specific modules that the instructor is actually qualified to instruct in. Oh, I should mention with that one, sorry, that is the training provider who has the responsibility to issue the WINDA training records every 12 months for the updated training for that instructor, and that the training provider should also retain evidence of the instructor actually delivering that module or participating in the qualification of other instructors just for documentation purposes with regards to auditing. Clause 8.2.4, at least once every 12 months and by means of a documented process, the instructor's competency must be assessed by the training provider using the instructor qualification assessment form found in Annex 5. The assessment must include an assessment against the criteria listed in 8.1.3 for at least one module the instructor is qualified to deliver. For instructors qualified to deliver more than one module, an assessment cycle whereby the instructor's assessment rotates between the different modules, meaning a different module is assessed each year following sequential order of the module qualifications listed in instructor affiliations in WINDA. The record of the assessment must be created using the instructor qualification assessment form, which is found in the annex, and the completed instructor qualification assessment form must be uploaded in instructor affiliations in WINDA for that instructor. I will point out that this is already a requirement, or was a requirement in the previous version of the requirements for training, so this is nothing new. The addition or the changes that have been made here are the introduction of the instructor qualification assessment form. Now we're standardizing how that information is recorded. Previously, that was up to the training provider. Additionally, we're only required, so for the instructors that are qualified to deliver multiple modules, previously you'd have to do this for each and every module. Now we're saying you only have to do it for one of the modules that the instructor is qualified for. And that goes through a rotation system. So imagine, again, if we use the BST as an example, I'm qualified to deliver, let's say, fire awareness, first aid, working at heights and manual handling. I'll do it in that order. So year 1, I'll do my fire awareness. Year 2, first aid. Year 3, working at heights. Year 4, manual handling. And that's how it will work. Pointing out as well that it's per module, and when we talk about different modules where an instructor perhaps delivers a different module for one training provider compared to the other, each different training provider will have to do this for those instructors that are affiliated with them. The reason for that, of course, is that they have different facilities. And part of what's listed in 8.1.3 is understanding how the instructor needs to deliver that module within those specific facilities, within that specific training provider setup, and within that specific risk assessment that has been conducted by that training provider. What it means is that each training provider will need to follow those affiliations that are linked to that training provider themselves. So the instructor may be delivering one module for one training provider and a different module for the other training provider. What it means is that they need to be actually assessed according to the modules that they're delivering for that training provider by that training provider. That's a bit complicated, but I hope it makes sense. One of the things that we did not have clearly described in the previous version was what actually happens if an instructor fails the competency assessment. In this case, we've clarified that, and the instructor needs to requalify to the module in accordance with 8.3, which is the section on instructor qualification. And then, of course, the training provider must remove the module from the instructor affiliations in WINDA. One of the things that was also missing, which we've added now, is what happens when an instructor wants to qualify for an additional module. So let's imagine I'm delivering some of the BST, but I want to get an additional module on scope. How do I actually do that? Well, essentially what happens is you start at step 2 of the qualification process, which means that you start with the module specific qualification, meeting the criteria outlined in 8.1.3, and then you do the assessment, again, according to the instructor qualification assessment form. So you're just doing a repeat of the initial instructor qualification process, but without the instructional background. The instructional background is a one-off, you do it once. And again, just like always, upon successful completion of the module, the training provider must add the new module to the instructor affiliations in WINDA. It's been mentioned quite a few times now. The instructor qualification assessment form is found in Annex 5, and it looks like this. It's 2 pages. It is used for all 3 types of qualification. So your initial qualification, your additional module qualification, and for the annual assessment, always being measured against the requirements outlined in 8.1.3. You'll see in it, it has an orange and a blue box. One means they've passed, orange means they've failed. And essentially, this is all of the bits of clause 8.13 outlined here, with the exception of the first aid requirement. The first aid requirement is an additional prerequisite qualification for the instructor. Previously, in the earlier edition of the requirements, it did state that a first aid trained person should be present during the delivery of practical training. However, the issue with that was that it didn't necessarily have to be the instructor, in which case it would be a course that would be dependent on someone else being present that had a first aid certificate. What we've done, we've adapted it and said now that an instructor needs to be able to deliver the first aid during practical training. This is a separate thing that needs to be recorded down here. In addition, in the comment section, we would like and request that you also list the instructional qualifications that the instructor has. So if they are delivering fire awareness, perhaps they've had some sort of firefighter training, just as an example. And then once it's completed, it needs to be uploaded into the instructor affiliations in WINDA. The form can be downloaded from GWO's website as a separate PDF. I'll show you where that is at the end of this webinar. One of the things which has been added is clause 9.1.9. This is to do with the safety of training. Here it now states the instructor should ensure that all course participants are adequately warmed up prior to participating in practical training. So we know that most GWO training does involve physical activity, and therefore it's important that participants are adequately warmed up prior to participation as to avoid injury. Now, some of the training standards, such as BST working at heights, does have a section describing warm-up, others don't. So, unless otherwise stipulated, warm-up does not constitute direct contact time for training. It is covered by the time described in clause 9.3.4, which is the entire training day, so it fits into the 10 hours and not the 8 hours. If you're looking for what the warm-up exercises should be, these can be found in the annex of the Basic Safety Training Standard. And there it has a whole lot of pictures and diagrams and for what type of warm-up exercises and activities you can do. Another thing that we've done here which again is to try and make things a little bit simpler, is to say that the instructor participant ratio doesn't apply to asynchronous e-learning delivered by delivering the knowledge domain. So you don't need to have a maximum cutoff of 12 participants to an e-learning course. This change is quite significant. The participant performance assessment form in Annex 3 should be used to give feedback to course participants at the end of the course and provide a record of the instructor's assessment of performance. The training provider must retain copies, physical or electronic, of the participant assessment forms for every participant in attendance of the training for every module they attend as a record of their assessment. These records must be provided to GWO upon request. So if someone's participating in the BST, there must be a separate form for each module. So each module results in a WINDA training record. Therefore, there should be a separate assessment for each WINDA training record. Clause 9.4.5, the required course participant assessment form is found in Annex 3. The training provider may adapt the form to other media. There's previously been quite a bit of confusion around what that actually means. Here, what I want to say is you must use the participant assessment form that is found in the requirements for training. You cannot change it. It has to have the same categories, the same grading criteria on it as the one that's found there. Some of the forms that we've looked at via sampling have included the ability to fail someone for the entire BST if they failed just one module, etc., and were quite non-compliant with the requirements for training. This change means that everyone for every single module, for every single training, needs to use the same participant assessment form. The form looks like this. It's quite a significant change to the old form. The old form assessed against the norm. Now we've introduced 2 new parameters for assessment. So you'll notice the first one is safety behavior during training. This concerns making sure that the participants are actually behaving safely. And the second one, which is quite significant, is the learning objectives. The form now requires a training provider to document that each participant has met the learning objectives as described in the GWO standard. Over here, you'll find that we asked for the training provider or the instructor doing the assessment to actually provide comments about the scoring. In particular, giving an account if the scoring is low, so a 0, a fail, or if it's extremely high, like a 3. What are the reasons behind that? The other thing you'll notice here is the form is now required to be signed by a participant. In version 14 of the requirements for training, clause 6.2.2F, the training provider was already required to have verifiable matching records of participant acknowledgement of performance assessment. What we're trying to do here is simply standardize that, make it easier for you guys to administer. But it's not a new requirement that a participant after training actually signs and accepts the result of that training. The completed participant assessment form does not need to be uploaded in WINDA. As it said before in one of the previous slides, it's up to the training provider to retain copies of this for auditing purposes, but it's not to be uploaded into WINDA. That's only the instructor qualification assessment form. One of the other things that we've introduced here, and this is not really a new thing, it did exist before. The addition here is the second sentence. A copy of the appeals procedure will be made available to course participants before the training starts. So here we're requiring the training provider to actually tell the participants what happens if they fail the course and want to appeal it, and they should be notified of this prior to the training starting. Now I'm going to move on quite quite too quickly through this, so it's going to be a very high level introduction to the recognition scheme. This is a completely new section, section 10, which has been added to the requirements for training. The scheme itself has been designed to reduce the amount of repeat training for persons entering the wind industry by recognizing existing qualifications. Clause 10.1.1 specifies a certified GWO training provider may become a recognition provider and gap trainer for the GWO modules that already certified to deliver. So you can only be doing this for those modules you're already certified to deliver. The steps for a training provider to become a recognition provider is, firstly, they need to develop an internal recognition process. That process then needs to be audited by their certification body, and then they'll become a recognition provider. At this point, they're actually not ready to do any sort of gap analysis or deliver any sort of gap training. They just have their setup approved to be able to now go out and gap analyze a training. What happens then, they'll take the legacy training, we're calling the training to be gap analyzed, so the training for the existing qualification legacy training. They'll take this and then they'll conduct the gap analysis. They'll provide a copy of the legacy training documents and documentation that they're using to conduct the gap analysis, as well as the training plan for any gap training. This then needs to be submitted to GWO. GWO will then do an internal audit of this, review all of those documentations that have been sent in, and either approve or reject the gap analysis of that legacy training. If it is approved, then they will be able, then that recognition provider will be able to provide the gap training and full recognition, which will result in a WINDA training record. The criteria for doing gap analysis is outlined in 10.2.1. So a legacy training must be analyzed by a recognized training or trainers run by a current GWO member. Within the definitions, there is a description of what recognized training actually means and what it isn't. In addition to this, to do the gap analysis, the recognition provider actually must use the recognition gap analysis template, which is provided by GWO. So GWO provides the template for each module that needs to be used when gap analyzing a legacy training. And finally, which is quite important, the legacy training must actually also be valid and available at the time of analysis. So training that existed 10 years ago that no longer exists cannot be incorporated into this scheme. Another highlight that I want to point out here, again, keeping it very high level, is that the gap training, it needs to be delivered by the same training provider that did the initial training, the initial gap analysis. And it needs to comply with section 9 of the requirements. Finally, with taking it to the final section of the requirements for training, incidents have been updated. We've aligned the definitions of G+. This has resulted in 2 additional definitions. The first one is near miss, which is an undesired or unplanned event that could potentially have caused injury to a person on a training site. Near misses are often considered to be close calls, almost accidents that serve as warnings and provide opportunities to prevent future incidents. So again, this is a separation from significant near miss to near miss. It's a lower level. We're not talking about something that could have potentially resulted in a significant incident or significant injury to someone. The other addition is medical treatment case, an incident where medical treatment by a physician is required beyond the treatment stated in first aid. So now that brings us to 6 different categories for incidents: near miss, significant near miss, first aid, medical treatment case, incident, and significant incident. For each incident, an incident investigation must be conducted by the training provider who's affected, and a report must be produced and submitted to GWO. Incident investigation must focus on identifying and correcting the causes of a problem and not the symptom of the problem. Thus demonstrate commitment to safe training. Reporting incidents and near misses. Any GWO incident, first aid case, medical treatment case, or near miss must be reported to GWO in the file and incident page within 7 calendar days of occurrence. You will notice if you go into the page now on the website, there's only one report button, not two. This again is to try and simplify the process. So all incidents, including significant incidents, are reported via the same button. Again, I just want to highlight here, 7 calendar days. Significant incidents, slightly different, must be reported GWO, but within 24 hours of occurrence. In addition to that, when it's a significant incident, an investigation report must be submitted by the affected training provider within 7 calendar days of the significant incident happening. We have the right to review and complete the report to request further information that is deemed relevant. The review is a qualitative assessment of the investigation's findings, the root cause analysis, and the corrective actions to assist GWO in the continued efforts to create safe training modules. One thing that no longer exists here is that you must cease training until GWO approve for you to continue. That is up to the training provider and the certification body in some cases, and local authorities, depending on what the significant incident is, to determine when the training may continue. Right, that's pretty much it in terms of requirements of certification, requirements of training. Like I said, there are many more updates in there. What I'm going to do now is show you guys essentially where you can find supporting information and documents that we have talked about here. So when we're talking about the requirements of certification, when you click on the governance page in GWO website, this will appear, and you'll notice on the right hand side there's a lot of downloadable documents. So here you'll find frequently asked questions. You'll notice in this picture, maybe it's too small, but the questions are referenced to the clauses. So if you have a question about a clause, go into the frequently asked questions, find that clause in the question, and you'll probably find the answer. Most of these questions have come from feedback we've received as part of the reviewing process, so people have asked these questions before. You'll also find the audit report template, the new version here. Here you'll find one for the multi-site. Down here you'll find the frequently asked questions for the audit report template. And from the 1st of October, these 3 groups of downloadable documents will disappear. And that again is when the grace period ends. When you go into the page for the requirements for training, you will be able to again see a list of documents. Here you'll see the participant performance assessment form as a writable PDF that can be separately downloaded, so you don't have to try and get it out of the document itself. Again, you'll find frequently asked questions linked to the clauses in those requirements. You'll find the instructor assessment the instructor qualification assessment form as a downloadable PDF. You'll also find a medical assessment form. The purpose statement, which was mentioned before in relation to the participant feedback, is also found here. And you'll be able to find the gap analysis for the instructor qualifications. This is the gap analysis template against the IQT, which is used to document an equivalent instructor training that someone has been through, which you want to get as their instructional background. And again, from the 1st of October, the requirements version 14 will disappear from here. Instructor affiliations in WINDA, there's also documentation that can help you here, if you haven't seen that. If you go to About GWO on the website, About WINDA in the menu down there, and click on WINDA user guides, you'll find a user guide for training records and user guide for instructor affiliations there, right here. If you go in and look at the recognition scheme, You'll see there's an orange button in the top right corner on the website that will lead you to the recognition page. Here at the top of that, it's actually at the bottom of the page, but at the top of the gap analysis table there, you'll find that there's a guide on how to fill out the gap analysis templates. Each gap analysis template can be downloaded for each standard, and these are in a list order at the bottom. And under the list at the very bottom, you'll find how you submit the gap analysis once it's filled out to GWO for it to be internally audited. That's down there. Incident reporting. If you need to report an incident that's occurred during your training, again, we encourage everyone to report their incidents as this will help us create a better training. You'll find it in the governance under file and incident, but there's also something called resolutions and reports, which we'll get to in a second. Here, file an incident, there's the orange button now. There's only one, which says file an incident with GWO. There's no longer two. That's where you file all incidents. For previous incidents that have occurred, if you click on the resolutions and reports page, you'll find a searchable list and overview of all the incidents that have occurred previously at GWO training, so the ones that have been reported to GWO. And the intention here, again, is to provide something that can help training providers who are perhaps delivering the same standards in making their training safer. Perhaps one of the mitigations here, so we'll give you, for each instance that's occurred, you get a summary of the incident and the mitigation that was put into place by the training provider. So when you're doing your risk assessments of a training, go to this page, look at the training modules there. You can search the module. So in this case, you can see working was typed in, so all the working at height stuff came up. Check out, maybe there's something in there that you hadn't considered in your risk assessment that could be relevant for you. So that service is there as well. There's also a help center on the website if you haven't seen it. Up here, it says help center at the top. When you click on that, it'll open a help center page, and there will be different things that you can click on. In addition to that, down here, we have our little robot, which will a bot, which you can type questions to, and it will hopefully answer some of those questions that you have. Finally, prior to this webinar, we had the option of people being able to submit some questions. We've had a few questions, and I'm going to answer those now. So the first question that came in says in version 14, training requirements, there are some types of technology for digital learning. Are they still included or have they been discontinued? In this version, we're taking a broad approach to digital learning. We're moving away from what types of technology there is to what the technology can do, meaning we're concerned with how the digital technology allows participants to achieve the learning objectives. So we're no longer having a list of what constitutes digital or not digital. What we're saying is, what domain are you using the digital technology to deliver in? And that will determine if it needs to be audited or not. And then that will determine what it needs to do. So you'll see again in the definitions at the start, there is a definition for digital learning technology. So if whatever it is you're using falls within that definition, then it is covered by the requirements for training. Another question that came in, can you explain what needs to be done for a new instructor to be qualified under the POCD process with the new requirements for training? So here we're talking about a new instructor. So they need to meet those instructional background requirements, IQT, IQTX, or equivalent, where there's been a gap analysis conducted. Then they go through that next section, which is the module-specific qualification process using the POCD. In this case, they'll participate, so complete the module as a participant. Then they'll observe the delivery of the training module in full. Then they will co-deliver the module for qualified instructor. Remember, in this case, they need to have planned in advance which sections of the module will be delivered by the qualified instructor and which will be delivered by the new instructor. keeping in mind that they need to deliver across all of the different taxonomic domains as described in the GWO taxonomy. And then they'll deliver observation, and this again constitutes as the exam, whereby the assessing training provider will use the instructor qualification assessment form to sign off that instructor. And then they're qualified to deliver GWO. Another instructor question came in. As an instructor, can you explain exactly what I should do with training centers I'm working with to comply with the standard? So, to comply with the requirements as an instructor, for each training center, you must, of course, be qualified to deliver the module you're instructing, following the instructor qualification process. You must participate in the ongoing competency and familiarization programs that are run by that training provider. You, of course, need to maintain your instructor qualifications by successfully completing the annual competency assessment run by the training provider. Again, that's using the instructor qualification assessment form. And as an optional, if you have WINDA training records that you want to maintain, you must be delivering that module at least once every 12 months or participate in the qualification of other instructors within that module. So that's what you need to do to remain as an instructor and to be compliant with the standard. Next question that came in regarding section 1.8 of the requirements for training, initial instructor qualification process. The current POCD process has been deleted, and a note added stating POCD is one possible option for module-specific qualification. We believe this is not a common expression for the standard. Many training providers use POCD to qualify their instructors and wish to know if POCD will continue to be accepted. Clarification is required if GWO plans to phase out POCD. The timing should be communicated to stakeholders for proactive response. So, POCD, as we know, stands for Participate, Observe, Co-Deliver, Deliver, and is available as one of the options for module-specific qualification. We're not phasing it out. We're going to continue to accept it, and it will continue to be written there. If you go into those frequently asked questions for the requirements for training, it's also stipulated there, and an explanation of explicitly what needs to be done for the P, the O, the C, and the D section is written. The only thing that's not the same here is the additional of the first aid requirement for instructors. Regarding Annex 3 of the requirement for training, the Participant Performance Assessment Form. The form has been updated for training providers to obtain participant signature. Are participants expected to sign before or after the actual assessment? The consent says, by signing below, you confirm the assessment criteria review process were both made clear to you prior to the assessment and you've read the assessor's final decisions and comments for the assessment. We assume the appropriate timing when the assessment method is explained on day one, but this needs GWO clarification. So, it's not really possible for you to read the assessor's final decision before you've been assessed. Therefore, the form needs to be signed on completion of the training module. Keeping in mind that it's referencing day one. I think this is a misunderstanding. You need to have one assessment form per module. So if you're doing the whole BST, you can't just use one form for the entire BST. What happens if they fail manual handling but pass all of the other modules? It doesn't work. You need to have one assessment per module that leads to a WINDA training record. Please also keep in mind that they also need to sign the form if they fail the course. And again, this should happen after the course. And that's pretty much it for the webinar. There's a few other things coming up that I want to do a little bit of an advertisement for. On the 29th of April, we have an API webinar. Again, we're talking now, we've introduced a few changes. You'll also notice things about versioning. This means that there's a new API setup that is relevant to anyone using WINDA and an API. We're going to have a standard release webinar coming up on the 22nd of April. The GWO Forum and Safety Awards is on the 7th and 8th of October in Madrid. In relation to that, the final submission closes on the for the Safety Training Awards. And this is for Young Achiever, Training Team of the Year, and Instructor of the Year. This closes next week on the 30th of April. For all of these events, you can find more information on our website. If this webinar has raised any questions, you can reach out via info@globalwindsafety.org, and we'll try our best to clarify them. That's it for today, and I want to thank everyone for participating.